There was a paragraph in the essay. He said, today's Labor is a graveyard of lost futures with nobody mourning them. Every time something doesn't work, it's discarded. The Republic, a new flag, the Voice, seriously challenging the way schools are funded, changes to negative gearing, capital gains tax, carbon price. And what I wrote after that was, that is a brutal truth. It is so accurate.
This government is not facing any of those barriers that Julia Gillard was facing, obviously not facing the major barrier that Bill Shorten was facing. In addition, it has a Prime Minister who has been in Parliament for decades. It is facing a depleted opposition that is in utter chaos. I think that this government might be capable of a lot more than it has yet allowed itself to believe.
The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Tuesday evening on the lands of the Lenape people. I am back in New York City. I've been getting shit from a lot of my friends because they're all making out this is now my hometown. It's not, but I am back here for a bit of work. Last week on the pod with David Feeney and Jesse McCrone, we were talking a bit about what Labor stands for, and we name-checked a quarterly essay that's been written, and I actually said on the show, maybe we should get the writer on to talk a bit about it. And a week later we have. Good job by Grace, our producer. Sean Kelly was a former press sec for both Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and for the last 10 years he's worked on the media side as a political writer and commentator. He's also the author of The Game, a portrait of Scott Morrison. But today on this episode, we are going to focus on his feature in the latest edition of the quarterly essay. He wrote an essay titled The Good Fight. What does Labor stand for? Sean Kelly, thanks so much for joining us on Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me on. How's Mamdani territory?
Well, I was here the week of the election, and it only dawned on me today I'm back. I was like, I'm actually now in sort of Mamdani-led city, and it hasn't changed too much at this point anyway. It's just got colder and wetter since I was here 3 weeks ago. I've only been here for like 12 hours, so I'll have to get a sense from – I've got a bunch of meetings this week, so we'll find out if things have changed. First of all, congratulations on the essay. I managed to read it today here in New York, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was interesting because Grace, our producer, also read it, and she made some notes for me in terms of sort of the run sheet. And she said how remarkable it was about an essay that was perhaps incredibly critical of Labor. And I read it, and I didn't think it was critical. I thought it was a critique, and I don't want to sort of play on words or be picky with what Grace's reflections are. But I thought to myself, wow, I wonder how other people have interpreted this essay amongst the party faithful. What kind of feedback have you received from folks out there in the Labor heartland about your essay on what Labor stands for?
Look, honestly, very mixed, and I like to think that reflects the struggle that is in the essay itself, because the essay, I think the essay is a real struggle. It was a struggle for me to write because I was really trying to figure out what I feel about this Labor government and to take into account its arguments, but also to take into account my doubts about some of those arguments. And, as I write in the essay, I really veer in a very volatile fashion back and forth. Like there are days when I look at the various things and I can add them up and I think, these are making a difference. And then there are days I kind of throw my hands up in despair and think these guys are wasting their time. So that is broadly the reflection I'm getting from people. I've had a lot of interest in the essays. I've travelled around the country, which has been fantastic. And some people want to defend the government, take it as a critique or take it as a criticism, I suppose, and want to say, well, the government is doing these things. And quite a few people are, really worried that the government isn't doing enough. I had one bloke come up to me and say he's been a Labor Party member forever and he almost gave up his membership this year and he definitely will next year, or he thinks he definitely will next year. So who knows what will actually happen. So I think that kind of split in myself is reflected in people who follow Labor, at least. Those people who think it's tracking pretty well, and those people who are really wondering what's going on.
Just give us a bit of an overview of the essay itself. What's the central thesis of the essay?
Well, let me tell you where it started. It started in two places that originally I thought were separate. One was I was driving one day to pick up my son from childcare, and I got on the phone, safely, hands-free, to talk to my grandfather's wife, Jo, and she asked me in the course of this conversation what I believed. And I kind of stuttered out a couple of things about the equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, and I realised that I didn't have a very good answer. And so that started me down a bit of a rabbit hole of thinking about exactly where belief lives in us and what it is. And then the other strand of it was that I was watching this government and writing about them every week. And I think on the face of it, they have clear values. On the face of it, they are an old school Labor government. Anthony Albanese obviously cares about wages, about workers, about Medicare. I think a lot of people, I think quite rightly, get the sense that Anthony Albanese is a sincere person, that when he says he wants to look after the most vulnerable and leave nobody behind, that is genuinely what he means. He really feels that. And alongside all of those things, I just found myself puzzled. I found myself feeling like there was something I didn't quite grasp, some mysterious quality. And the more I thought about what that was, I'm not saying it's the perfect word for it, but the best word that I could come up with for it was belief. What does this government believe? And so the essay was an attempt to get to grips with both of those questions. What is belief? To some extent, what I believe, but I certainly don't arrive at a clear conclusion on that. And what does this government believe? And what role does belief play in politics?
I want to talk about the belief theme in a moment, but you kick off the essay by reflecting on the 2025 federal election, and you quote a couple of journalists, Ross Giddens and Greg Sheridan. And I must say, as a political campaigner, the minute I hear a journalist critique an election campaign when none of them have ever campaigned before, it just absolutely burns my piss. And I remember reading the quotes that you dropped in there, and I was like, oh my God, here we go again. But essentially they were saying that that it was ultimately the campaign was very trivial, and that Labor and Liberals seemed scared to put too much air between them and annoy potential voters. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, no, I don't think there's ever been a political campaign in which two political parties have gone into it with these big, lofty, sort of West Wing kind of Aaron Sorkin type aspirations about how they want to present an argument to the electorate. Ultimately, you just got to win the damn thing. So, but you have been a political operative, so I want to ask you: do you agree with their assumptions of the 2025 campaign? I respect your thoughts more, Sean, than I will of Ross Giddens or Greg Sheridan. I mean, what did you make of the 25 campaign?
Look, it's a really good point, Stephen. There's obviously a difference between a good election campaign, as in an election campaign that is fought in an effective way, and an election campaign that touches on important issues. And, I think if you look back at Labor campaigns and Labor prime ministerial campaigns, there have been some that have dealt with pretty big issues. You could look at those shifts from opposition to government. Whitlam, most famously, had a almost insanely long policy speech as part of his campaign. Kevin Rudd, I think, actually did launch some pretty big ideas into that 2007 campaign around health and hospitals, around what was termed the education revolution. I think there was a pretty sharp contrast there, also around some elements of climate change, though John Howard tried to meet it. Which I think what was interesting about this campaign, in terms of what Giddens and Sheridan wrote, is that there are some very big issues facing this country right now. Inequality is one. There wasn't a huge amount said about that, a little bit, but not a huge amount. Climate change, obviously. Obviously there was a bit of a gap there with the nuclear policy, but mostly it kind of was minimised a little bit. And in fact, the government deliberately chose not to debate climate change targets, right? And that was an example of a debate being avoided. So you had these very large issues facing the country: inequality, climate change, definitely our relationship with America, and they were all kind of put on the low burner. And to your point, fair enough from a campaigning perspective, right? Anthony Albanese did exactly what he needed to do. It was a very sharp campaign from Paul Erickson. You're not going to get any debate from me on that. But there's this question about, did it tell us anything about what the government really and truly stands for? And I'm not sure you did get a great sense of that. And I think you can see that in the commentary afterwards, however sceptical you might be of it. There is a sense that Anthony Albanese ran a small target campaign in 2022, and from a campaigning perspective, brilliant, absolutely what you needed to do against a rabidly unpopular Scott Morrison. And I think there's a sense that he ran another small target campaign in 2025. Again, as we learned from the electoral study out this week that showed Peter Dunn is the most unpopular leader in the history of doing these studies. Again, the right approach. Let the Liberals tear themselves down if you're Labor. But I think it does point back to that small target approach. It does point back to the lack of big ideas on offer.
So let's talk about this idea about beliefs. And I really enjoyed the self-reflection in the essay that you took. I mean, you touched on it a little bit before, but why did you want to start there? Why was that the starting place for this essay?
Well, as I began to think about what I believe, and as I began to talk to people about this, I realised that probably a lot of the time when I think about what I believe, it's more a feeling than anything else. And it's not just a feeling. Very often it's a reaction to something. Very often it's something somebody else says. They say something that outrages me, that makes me feel the injustice of it, and I react to that. And I think when I think of myself as believing something, it's really those feelings I'm keeping in mind. But I think different people would put this differently. Some people would say it's a feeling. Some people would say they can articulate a really clear philosophy. My experience, as I've talked to people about this, is that very few people can, that a lot of people feel like they believe something clear, but when you start to press on it, it's actually something that's quite hard to say. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody doesn't believe something, but I think it does raise the question of where exactly does belief exist? How do we figure out what we believe? How do we figure out what someone else believes? And I came across the work of a philosopher, Daniel Dennett, and he writes that belief is measurable in our patterns of behaviour. So if we say somebody believes something, it should allow us to predict the way that they will behave. And I think that that's really interesting. I'm not 100% sure it's true of each of us entirely. I think in a way we exist between two poles. We have a feeling. We want to do certain things. Also, we live in the world. We're constrained by the world. So, I think in a way we're judging ourselves very harshly if we say we only believe what we do. But I really think it is a useful way to think about politics and our politicians, because I think politicians are very often given the alibi, especially in the media, especially in long profiles written of politicians, where people say, this is the real person. This is what they're like behind the scenes. Actually, this person is really lovely, and those things are interesting to know, and they can sometimes tell us some interesting things about the way the person will act in public life. But I think ultimately, when we're measuring a politician's belief, we do get to measure it by their patterns in behaviour. So for me, I got to see that there was that connection between how we think about belief at a personal level and how we judge and measure our political parties.
I found it real. I mean, I 100% agreed with what you wrote in that, and it struck me in many ways, particularly as a practitioner of community organising and of public narrative. It was almost, the way that you wrote it, it was written different to how I would speak it. And if I get a metaphor, it'd be like you're speaking Scots Gaelic and I was speaking Irish. They're both Celtic languages, and I'm kind of understanding the words you're saying. But it's, you know what I mean? What do you think Anthony Albanese believes in, or what do you think Anthony Albanese's values are?
I'll say a couple of things. In a way, I try to keep the essay away from the personal, and in some ways for exactly the reason I just gave, which is that I think that we need to look at what people actually do. When I do look at Anthony Albanese, the person, as I indicated before, I think he believes fundamental old school Labor things. I think he believes in communal action. I think he believes in looking after the most vulnerable. And what I struggled with, to come back to how I started this essay, the perplexity, the thing that was puzzling me about the government, I think it's because I feel those things about the Prime Minister, but I don't always see them in the way the government acts. And obviously this is a really difficult question, right? No government, no Prime Minister, no Premier can do exactly what they want to do. They are constrained by many, many things. And politics is about that battle between your beliefs and your constraints. And what I'm trying to figure out in the essay is how much has this government allowed itself to become overly constrained? How much does it think it is more constrained than it actually is? And how much of that is a product of the Labor Party's history? Where does that sense of constraint come from? And some of that is absolutely in Anthony Albanese himself and his own experiences in politics. And some of it, I think, is about the development of the Labor Party over time. So there are real structural factors. I'm dodging your question in a way about exactly what Anthony Albanese believes, because I think fundamentally we won't know until the government falls, and also because we need, in judging any politician, I think we do need to hold them responsible for their actions above anything else.
You do go to a bit about, you talk about how Anthony Albanese had said, I think it was during the Rudd Gillard leadership challenges, that he said that what he stands for is he stands for fighting Tories.
Yeah.
I thought that was a perplexing statement.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I think that, one of the reasons I'm in the Labor Party is because it aligns with my own belief system broadly, not everything.
Sure.
Otherwise that would be kind of boring. But I'm doing it for proactive change, not to stop something else. I think that the Conservatives actually exist to stop Labor, not the other way around. And I found that interesting in the essay that you sort of talked a bit about examples of, and you did point, you raised actual factual moments where Labor has existed to stop someone else. So I can't push back on that. But I think broadly speaking that if you're Labor, you're Labor because you actually want to impact change. You want to create change. Because I remember reading, Politics 1A at La Trobe University in my very first year, and Dean Jench talking about the split of the political party system in Australia. You're either Labor or you're anti-Labor. And I felt that to say that I'm here to fight Tories is actually their language. I wouldn't normally say that. Do I agree with the Liberal Party? No. Do I agree with the Greens? No, they're not my people, right? And I want to win, but I actually want to put forward my contribution to our movement is to put forward our ideas to the electorate and say, well, what do you think about that? As opposed to just fighting Tories. I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes exactly to this question of the intersection of the personal and the structural. If you look at Anthony Albanese's rhetoric, there is this really interesting pattern that comes up. One of the things I find when I'm writing any longer piece is you have to come up with a question. As I said, one of my questions was, what does this government believe? And once you've come up with a question, and that takes a while, little bits of the answer start kind of coming towards you. And one of the bits was this pattern in his rhetoric. And I started noticing that it was oddly framed in the negative. So there's that phrase, I like fighting Tories. And if you home in on that phrase for a second, there are different ways you could say what that means, right? You could say, I like fighting Tories to deliver huge Labor projects. I like fighting Tories to deliver things that will last through the ages. Anthony Albanese was asked earlier this year what he meant when he uttered that immortal phrase, and he said it means not giving up the gains that have been made. So he took a phrase that was framed in the negative and again framed it in the negative. He talked after the election about progressive patriotism, which was an elaboration of something he'd started doing during the campaign, which was to talk about the Australian way. And again, that sounds like a positive doctrine, but it started off in saying we don't want to copy the ideologies of other nations. It was about not being America. And even in his most famous phrase, or the one he uses the most about what the government stands for, is not leaving anyone behind and not holding anyone back. And I think that relates to a kind of developed allergy in centre-left governments towards saying what they actually believe and what they actually want to do. And I think this is because it's because of a few factors, but a significant one was the collapse of socialism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And it wasn't because the Labor Party back in the 80s and 70s was a Soviet government, a Soviet party, but it did used to talk about socialism. From the beginning of the Labor Party, socialism has been one way that the Labor Party has expressed its idealism, broadly meaning equality, general equality across society. But the Labor Party, along with the British Labor Party, along with other centre-left governments across Europe, suddenly couldn't talk about socialism anymore. It became a taboo word. And I think that left large parts of the centre-left without a way of expressing what they were for. And that occurred in Australia at the time as another important development, which is the Greens becoming a significant political party. And I think, you've always had this debate within Labor between idealism and pragmatics, socialism once upon a time and the desire to win elections. And that struggle existed within Labor. But when the Greens came along, I think the Greens kind of took some of that idealism or the claim for idealism outside the party. And that meant suddenly that Labor defined itself in opposition to that pure idealism, if you like. And I'm not saying like that's the way to go, but I think that's one way we could represent what the Greens symbolise in Australian politics, a kind of pure idealism. And so that made Labor take on a mantle of more pragmatics. And you can see that in the way lots of Labor people speak and the way Anthony Albanese speaks when he says we're the party of progress and they're the party of protest. Totally legitimate argument, but I think it does point to the way Labor has become more and more and more attached to the idea of itself as a body that wins elections. Always important to Labor's mission, very obviously. Famously, Gough Whitlam declared the impotent are pure. But when Whitlam declared that, in that same speech, he was also talking about the importance of socialism and the importance of equality and quality of life as markers of socialism. So I think Labor has moved more and more towards that pragmatic side of things. And I think that has left it without this, well, it's chicken and egg a little bit, but Labor doesn't have this clear thing that it is arguing for. And I think that means, in a way, that it's not heading anywhere in particular. And then this other thing happened, which is one of the big developments in right-wing parties over the last decade or so, has been that they have begun to attack institutions in a very significant way. So rather than the Conservatives being literally conservative and wanting to conserve institutions, they've kind of dodged away from the neoliberal compact, if you like, and they've started to attack all of the institutions on which our current society is built. And that has left Labor, I think, in this reactive stance of defending those institutions. And I think that places Labor in this quite conservative stance. So when we talk about Anthony Albanese framing his rhetoric in the negative, it's not just that he's framing his rhetoric in the negative. When he talks about not making Australia more American, when he talks about keeping the gains that have been made, he's talking about stopping Australia from changing, not wanting it to be more American, not wanting it to give up the benefits it has. Arguably laudable aims, but definitely conservative in their stance. Now, you can make a case for that if you like, but as you point out, Stephen, that is a dramatic shift in the political landscape. It is a dramatic shift in the way we have historically thought about what the Labor Party does and what the Conservative parties do.
I often find, and if I'll be a bit more abstract here, so I'm not just talking about the Prime Minister, I think I'm talking more about Labor Party politicians and candidates, and maybe even more broadly activists as well, that when we ask someone, what do you stand for, their default answer now is, and I've made this mistake, well, not a mistake, I've said this as well, I stand for Labor values.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, what does that even mean? It's now become our default answer. And if you're trying to communicate to a voter, that they don't know. I don't think they know what that means, and so therefore you are not building that connection with that person. I think that we've subcontracted our belief structure to some buzzwords, essentially, or even if we're trying to perhaps develop some public narrative, a story of self. It's been regarded as a log cabin story. And, people refer to Anthony Albanese's log cabin story. Not all of us were born in log cabins. I'm the fifth child of a migrant family that, when they arrived on the boat in 1957, it was mum and dad and their eldest son in a suitcase. But by the time I came along, mum and dad were firmly ensconced in the middle class. My life's been a boulevard of green lights. I'm known as a golden child in my family. Like I don't have a log cabin story, but my belief system, the values that define who I am, have been shaped by moments. And you started to touch on it in the essay as well. What I want to push people in the party to do is it requires, in terms of public leadership, forms of self-reflection to recall when those values were first shaped. And to your point about the academic I forgot the person's name that you were talking about, the belief structure.
Daniel Dennett.
Yeah. He was kind of going there that our values are shaped in moments of challenge, essentially. That's what Marshall Gantz's theory in public narrative is that, if the value of family is important to you, when did you first feel the love of family, but when was that love tested? When were you challenged? Was it the death of a parent? Or was it, you had to move away from your family for work? And how did you react to that? Like how did you respond to that challenge? What choices did you make? Therefore, we see the courage in you. Therefore, you act. And it's through those actions we see what you value in life. And I think that what we need to see more often from our own people in public leadership is to actually go and reflect on that. Like someone you could quote in your next essay, Rabbi Hillel, a 6th century scholar from Jerusalem, asked these 3 self-reflective questions in public leadership. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Meaning, if I can't articulate what my own values are and resources that I hold, no one else is going to do it for me. If I'm for myself alone, what am I? Meaning that we can't do this work on our own. We need to find our other kindred spirits that share those same common values and experiences and how we can work together. And the third one, if not now, when? And that's what struck me a lot through your essay, in particular, when we talk about risk, is, well, if not now, when? Like the words of Hawke Keating in your essay, like, I was put on this earth to don't waste a single day. Like, let's just get going, right? Daniel Andrews is a similar kind of politician. Was like, I don't know how many campaigns I've got in me. I don't know how many governments we're going to be. Let's not waste time and find out and wondering why. And so, if not now, when is that question of talk is cheap unless it turns to action. I don't know if that resonates with you or your thoughts on that.
No, it absolutely resonates with me. One of the most gratifying things about having the essay out in the world, it is a political essay. It is about Labor, but a part people have really responded to is this provocation to consider what they believe and to consider, I've had so many people say to me now to consider how their actions match up against their words, match up against their own sentiments. And I think that relates directly to this question of if not now, when, because, if we begin that task of measuring our actions against our words, the next question is, well, if I want to change this, if I want to make my actions match my sentiments more clearly, when do I begin that process? Because all of us at every moment are already trapped in a web of constraints. We're trapped in the web of the practicalities of the world. And if we want to make our actions match our feelings more closely, at some point we have to find a way of breaking through those constraints, of deciding that some of those constraints don't matter as much as we thought they did, or of getting rid of them in some way. Sometimes of just staring them down, realizing that what you thought was a barrier isn't a barrier at all, that the things that people have told you were impossible aren't actually impossible. And this is obviously a central question for this government. It is telling itself, and it is telling the public, we need time. We need time to embed changes. We need time to build an accumulation of changes into something larger. And that may be true. As I said before, there are days when I find that utterly plausible. And there are days where I think the argument that the government makes outwardly, which is give us time, I worry it's a real trap for the government itself, because at the end of 3 terms, at the end of 4 terms, proceeding slowly, I worry that they'll look around at each other and suddenly realize they're still waiting. They're still waiting for the big moment to get going, to make the big changes. Now, maybe not. Maybe everything we have seen and everything we are seeing will add up to big change in ways that are hard to appreciate right now. But there are certainly some pretty significant things not being touched, and it is hard to know exactly when the conditions will be right. And just one point on this is, I think it is an utterly legitimate argument that inflation was a huge barrier for the government in its first term. It was, right? Like, if you're talking about tax reform, say, which I think is crucial if you're going to deal with inequality, it would have been pretty hard to launch a big tax debate into the middle of a cost of living crisis. The difficulty is that there are always reasons like that in government. There are always other things going on. There are always looming crises. Right now, in fact, we are in an environment where inflation may be getting worse again. So what does the government do in that circumstance? And it comes back to exactly that phrase, if not now, when?
I want to ask you about purpose, because I thought that was a theme that came through, particularly in the early parts. My experience running a political campaign or even a non-political campaign is it's so important at the start when you're sitting down with your people to first craft what in organising is we'd call a shared purpose. And sometimes you can do it and it sounds a little bit hippie and a little bit sort of touchy-feely or whatever. But all it is it's, the core central folks or the leaders that are working on the particular campaign is to come together and craft a purpose that defines who are we, what are we going to do, and how we're going to do it. Not a strategy, but who are we? Like, who exactly is in the room here? And what are we going to do, and how are we going to go about it? How are we going to support each other and work with each other? And really what it is, it's a value statement for the campaign. It's at the heart of the campaign. I did a political campaign in the last couple of years, and I was a campaign manager. And for whatever reason, we didn't do that. we just didn't sit down at the start of the campaign with the campaign leadership to do a shared purpose. Halfway through the campaign, it was quite clear to me that our campaign had no heart. It didn't understand at its core was the values that connected all of us. And so therefore, if internally we couldn't identify what our purpose was, then externally out to the public, we couldn't communicate what the purpose of the campaign was. And I'm just wondering about what is the purpose of this Labor government, and have they taken the time in their leadership, whether it be the caucus or the cabinet or whoever it needs to be, to get around and actually eyeball each other and go, right, what is at the heart of the work that we're doing? You see bits of it and I felt like you were trying to drag parts out of it in the essay. The one that kind of really struck with me was talking about kindness. You know, that kindness is a value. And people probably want a bit more kindness in this world, and maybe that's something you can build on. But I felt like you were reaching into the dark annals of this government to try and find what its purpose is. I don't know what do you make of that? What did you land on after writing this essay to understand what do you think the purpose of this government is?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it comes back to what I was saying before about the way Anthony Albanese often expresses himself in the negative and with conservative sentiments. It feels a lot as though he, like other centre-left leaders, is often trying to avoid stating exactly what it is. I quote in the essay him being asked about having said he was a social democrat, and he doesn't quite answer the question. He kind of comes back to what you were saying before about Labor, and I've seen him give exactly that answer before. I asked him in 2023 if he was a centrist, and he said, or if it was a centrist government, and he said, we're Labor. And I think you're right. It doesn't really tell us more. But I do think the kindness trope is really interesting. He said during one of the debates, kindness is not weakness. And he said on election night that kindness was an Australian value, and that facing global challenges the Australian way meant, in part, looking after each other. And I think those things are sincerely held by Anthony Albanese, and they, to me, are potentially a strong statement of belief. And the reason I say potentially is because I do think this rhetoric is important from prime ministers. One of the things I write in the essays is that John Howard changed the country in part by rhetorically reflecting a version of Australians to ourselves, relaxed and comfortable,
100%.
Self-satisfied, maybe a little bit smug. And that is, I think, the direction in which he dragged Australia. By reflecting that version of us to ourselves, he made it closer to reality. And so I think there is potentially a great deal of value, a great deal of force in having a prime minister who is willing to stand up in front of the country and say kindness is one of this country's values. It's not just boilerplate. When he says courage in adversity, I think, well, that's something every political leader from the beginning of time has said. But when he says kindness, that to me is really interesting. Also, worth noting, he is a male leader. I think kindness not that long ago would have been talked about as a kind of feminine thing. So I think that is really interesting as well in terms of political messaging, but also in terms of where the prime minister is coming from. But the caveat I put on this is the same caveat I put on everything I hear from the government at this stage, which is the other way that Howard changed the country was through actions, was through matching policy to that rhetoric. And I don't think we've seen quite enough from the government yet on the kindness front to say that that is absolutely something the government is focused on. We've had little green shoots of that, if you like. I think it's focus on care workers, it's focus on wages, paid leave in relation to domestic violence, paid parental leave. I think there are some important things there, and there is a lot more that could be done on inequality. There is a lot more that could be done on poverty, which I think if you're going to talk all the time about leaving nobody behind, poverty should pretty logically be a pretty large focus for that government. So I do think it's forceful and important, and I think we'll need to see more before we know just how important.
You touched on before about the barriers that are inhibiting this government to take risks. And in the essay, you sort of go to that and do a bit of an analysis of previous governments and some of, I guess, the tropes that we've always believed about certain governments. And as I'm reading, I'm going, yep, I think that. Yep, I think that. made the reader think a little bit deeper than just, the surface that the Hawke Keating governments were these big reform governments and were risk takers, and whereas the Rudd Gillard governments were, chaotic and look, and I've said it on this show before. We said it last week. We said that we think that this current Albanese government is trying not to repeat the mistakes of the Rudd Gillard years. And Anthony Albanese was a member of that government. He had front row seats, and maybe he's looked at the way that Hawke managed to over five, and you talk about this in the essay, five election wins to redefine our nation, that he wants to be more like a Hawke government than a Rudd Gillard government. You worked on those two governments. Is it sloppy for us just to say that the reason why they're not risk takers is because of the Rudd Gillard years?
No, I think it's hugely important influence on this government. I think it's probably the most important explanation we can give for the way this government behaves. That is tied to older ways that Labor feels and has structured itself. There's always been this sense of illegitimacy in Labor. In fact, Anthony Albanese spoke about it very recently, this sense in large parts of the community that Labor is illegitimate. And also I think that sense has existed within Labor. And that in turn means that Labor is too quick, I think, to spend too much time focusing on its mistakes. It really feels them as deep, deep scars. And you can see this most recently in the way Labor still talks about the Whitlam government. Anthony Albanese, when he was talking about Gough Whitlam, he listed the achievements. This is just a few weeks ago. But when he was talking about the lessons to be learned, he talked about the mistakes Gough Whitlam had made. And that to me was fascinating, because to me the most obvious thing we should be asking at this point is, how do we replicate the Whitlam government? That's what a Labor government should be asking. How does Labor do as much as that government did? And I think a big part of that was belief. So naturally enough, it focuses on the mistakes of the Rudd Gillard governments, and it zeroes in on two of them, I think. One is the enormous battles that government fought with big business, obviously absolutely shredded by the ferocious campaigns on the carbon price and the mining tax, hugely damaging to those governments. And so I definitely fear with this government that they go out of their way to provoking even the tiniest fight with business. Not every time, not on industrial relations, not on the pharmacy lobby, but very broadly, that is something that occurs again and again, a kind of backing away from fights with corporate Australia. And that dramatically restricts what this government is able to do. And then the second thing, and I think this is a real concern, is that it has looked at that government and thought, well, disunity destroyed it. And that was true at the end, but it wasn't how those problems started. The problem started with a hugely electorally popular Prime Minister, hugely dominant in his caucus and cabinet, that nobody felt they could confront. And so you had a caucus and a cabinet in which the problems kind of bubbled away before they exploded. Now, I don't think we're going to see a similar explosion of this government, but there's no real mechanism that is obvious to most of us, at least, for those problems to actually be dealt with. We heard about this most recently on gambling reform, reports that large numbers of Labor backbenchers are pretty unhappy with the government's direction on gambling reform, but won't say so publicly and won't say so in caucus either. And that feels to me a pretty worrying atmosphere. And the government will say, well, this is the most unified caucus in history. That also means it's the quietest caucus in history. Mm-hmm. And I think you do need a caucus. A political party isn't just the executive. It's not just the Prime Minister and the people around him or her. It is a grouping of people with ties to their electorates. And, I worry that is a real weakness in this government. And I think that comes out of the overreaction and the misread reaction to the Rudd Gillard years.
Some of the things you just mentioned there that I want to take out, and I just want to bring it to the listeners' attention. You talked about how Labor has felt like what was the word? It wasn't imposter, but it was
It might have been imposter, interloper.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like as if we've got imposter syndrome. Even when we're in power, we're amazed that we're there, and we don't want to, upset the cut, upset the what we think is the powers that be. And the Neville Rand quote that you had in there, that the Labor Party is this tremendous Australian institution, one of our few authentically Australian institutions, but it's still deemed in certain circles by the extremely powerful to be on trial, as it were, to our loyalty to the country. I genuinely 100% believe that is such a thing that is stuck in our heads. Like, we just need to shelve that. Like, I was at an event a couple of years ago, not long after the 2022 Victorian state election landslide, the third one. And I won't say what sporting event it was, but it was one of the big majors that is in Melbourne's sort of calendar. And the event is basically bankrolled by the Victorian state government, so therefore it's bankrolled by Victorian taxpayers. But it's partly the invite list is half done by the government and half done by the peak sporting body. Half the room were people who were from the Labor Party, and the other half were basically Tories. And I can tell you, I was in there not on the list because of the sporting group. I was in there because of the Labor Party. And I just sort of looked at everyone who were a bunch of Tories. I'm going, why are you here? How did you even get in the room? You've won one election in like the last 30 years. Like, you are not the center of power in this town anymore. Like, if I was going to be a robust prick, I'd be walking up to him going, shove off. Like, let some people from the community that participate in this sport to come and sit and dine at this table. Like, this feeling that we shouldn't. We're here by the grace of God. I just find absolutely fascinating. To second point to that, the fear that we have about the institutions that can make or break governments, in particular the media, in particular the Murdoch media. One of the things I loved about the Andrews government was they thumbed their nose at the Murdoch media and said, we don't need you. Because, you think about it, the Herald Sun brought down both the Kane government and then the Kerner government in spectacular fashion. And you would think that would get in our heads. And I think it was a little bit in the heads of the Bracks and Brumby years. You talk to sort of press sects that had worked in those years and how they still went on Neil Mitchell and, always try to get drops into the Herald Sun and that kind of stuff. Andrew's government, I think Daniel went on Neil Mitchell once in the 10 years, and that drove Neil Mitchell insane. He couldn't understand that. How can he possibly not come onto my program, yet continues to win relentlessly? The Herald Sun, we just didn't give them the things that they used to get. And I think that taking risks also has a requirement by Labor governments to actually strategically analyse where the power is. Anthony Albanese just won the biggest election victory in the history of our wonderful institution. Now, sure, our primary vote could be a hell of a lot higher, but in the end, that two-party preferred number is pretty big, and the amount of bums on the seats in that lower house is the highest it's ever been. So, therefore, there is some power in that room, and I'd like to see us go and take that for a bit of a spin. But obviously, that's not the case. That's not what we're getting a sense. And I said this on the show last week. Like, I'd like to think that come February, when everyone comes back from watching the cricket and the tennis and going to the beach, that we've got a clear agenda that we can map out to the people of Australia about what the next 3 years or the next 2 years looks like. But I just worry that at this stage, we're not going to see that. I want to get your thoughts on that. I mean, do you think that we are going to see some kind of outline of an agenda from the government, or is it just what we've seen is for the last 4 or 5 years is basically how it's going to be going forward?
Look, I really don't know. There is a sense that Anthony Albanese is much more confident than he has been. And, you might expect that after the election victory. And I'm interested to see where that confidence goes. It can go in one of two very different ways, right? He can either think, well, caution has got me this far, and despite everybody warning me against it, it's worked, so I'm going to keep on doing that, thanks very much, and close his ears to critics. Or he could think, well, okay, as you say, let's take this out for a spin. He's feeling more confident. He's prepared to try his hand at a couple of things. Now, it's worth thinking back to the government's first term. The government did take 2 risks, and risks, you touched on risks before. Risks are really important, I think. They're really important because they excite people. They excite your base, but they excite people more broadly. And I think for Labor in particular, that's important. Say in the SAA, long ago, a Labor elder said to me, the mob expects something more from Labor. And that phrase is always stuck in my head. I think that is true. They want Labor to demonstrate belief. They want Labor to reach for the stars, if you like. And in his first term, Anthony Albanese took 2 risks, and one of them was the stage 3 tax cuts, the broken promise on that. One of them was the Indigenous voice to Parliament. Obviously, the referendum went down and caused the government no end of political trouble. But the stage 3 tax cuts was very good for the government. It gave it some of its best weeks, I think, best weeks in the media. I think it did give a sense that, right, this was a Labor government. It was going into bat for more equality. It was prepared to take a risk to do so. And yet we haven't really seen a repeat of that. And maybe that's because it was followed by the voice failure. But what is interesting to me is that they both happened in the second year, which meant if both of those risks had gone pear-shaped, Anthony Albanese had a year to recover. And the thing you got to remember about Anthony Albanese is that he does plan for things. He does have structures in his head and chronological structures. And the thing you have to remember about all prime ministers is that they get into habits. When something works for them, they do it again. And so I am really interested to see if this government, with that increased confidence in the Prime Minister, takes on a couple of big risks in the second year. It's one of my big questions. It's one of the reasons I really don't feel that we are at a stage yet where we can say the character of this government is definitely this or definitely that. We're still in a bit of a wait and see place. But I think by the end of that second year, so in May, not next year, but the year after, we will be in a pretty clear sense to say, right, this is how this government operates.
There was a paragraph in the essay. I might maybe end on this one, although I like to end on a high note, so maybe I'll try and find another question. But no, I just the note I wrote after it. Actually, I'll read out the paragraph first, and then I'll give you my reflections. He said, "Today's Labor is a graveyard of lost futures, with nobody mourning them. Every time something doesn't work, it's discarded. The Republic, a new flag, the voice, seriously challenging the way schools are funded, changes to negative gearing, capital gains tax, carbon price." What I wrote after that is a brutal truth. It is so accurate. And often I think that it's not the fact that the idea was bad. I often think it's the execution, particularly on a number of those things in the Bill Shorten opposition. And you speak a bit about it in the next paragraph. But I often think it's the execution. When do you decide to do these things? Often means that, poor strategy will lead to a poor execution, which will lead to probably not getting up. And I think there are a couple of examples you can unpack, particularly on the big ones around carbon price, capital gains, and negative gearing. How much of that do you think was just execution and sort of Labor fumbling, just like, oh, we need to do this because our people demand of it now, but just couldn't pull it together when needed?
Oh, look, I think they were really specific circumstances, and you want to end on a high note for people who want changes like these. I think this absolutely leads to a high note, which is Julia Gillard introduced the carbon price in incredibly difficult circumstances. She had Kevin Rudd behind her. She had this wall of misogyny she was facing into. And she was in minority government. And at that time, the Murdoch press was far more powerful than it is now, I think, and was waging an incredibly ferocious campaign against that minority government. Bill Shorten, big changes, big ideas, was launching them from opposition. Now, it is always difficult, as John Hewson found out to his cost, to make the case for big, complicated changes from opposition. This government is not facing any of those barriers. None of the barriers that Julia Gillard was facing, obviously not facing the major barrier that Bill Shorten was facing. In addition, it has a Prime Minister who has been in Parliament for decades. Immense experience in how to get things done. It has an incredibly experienced cabinet as well. definitely with some scars from those Rudd Gillard years, but also with some useful experience and some useful knowledge. It is facing a depleted opposition that is in utter chaos. I think that this government might be capable of a lot more than it has yet allowed itself to believe.
Sean, that's why you were the political savant that you were. You've managed to turn a shit story into a great one right at the end there, and I appreciate that. That's fantastic. Well, he's hoping that we see that from our Labor government in the coming months and into 2026. Sean, first of all, thank you so much for your time on today's podcast. Really appreciate it. Those folks listen to the pod, please go out and buy the quarterly essay. It's a fantastic read. It's some of the best writing on this current Labor government that we've had in a long, long time. I think there are a few writers out there that can really understand the machinations of not just government, but a Labor government and write so well. And this is a fantastic example of it. And there's a personal component to it, Sean, that I think that a lot of writers don't put into. And I really appreciate your words in that respect as well. So we thank you for your words, and thanks for your time on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me and for such an in-depth conversation.
Cheers. Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like the show, then join our Patreon community for early and ad-free access to each episode. We regularly take questions and comments from our Patreon members, so get in there if you want to have your say. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.